Nothing brings us into such immediate contact with the culture of a bygone age as certain works of art. Whether it is a sacred image, a temple, a cathedral, or a mosque, it represents a focal point within the culture and expresses something essential. A building, such as the Great Mosque of Cordoba, is characteristic of Moorish culture in its full flowering, at the time when the Spanish Islamic Empire was united under the rule of the Umayyads. We are most fortunate that it still exists, for little else has survived of the former great capital, which was unrivaled by any city in the West, apart from Constantinople. In some places, the layout of the streets is reminiscent of the market area as it was in the time of Moorish rule, though today there would never be room for the 80,000 shops and workshops that it once held. Gone are the public baths and the inns where the merchants and their pack animals used to rest. The schools, where even the children of the poor received tutoring, and the many bookshops have all disappeared. One must try to imagine it without the dark church structure that was built between the Renaissance and the Baroque periods, and arbitrarily placed at the center of the light forest of pillars like a giant black spider. No present-day visitor to the Mezquita could regard the intrusion at the heart of this glorious building as either acceptable or valid, for it symbolizes not so much the victory of Christianity as it does the beginning of a new era when faith and knowledge began to diverge. It is in marked contrast to the clear and innate harmony that emanates from the form of the Islamic structure. Without this foreign element, the Hall of Pillars would resemble a broad grove of palm trees and provide ever-changing views into the interior of the columned hall. The courtyard was an integral part of the mosque, for it contained the fountains for washing the face, hands, and feet for the ritual purification before prayer. Shoes were removed before entering the great prayer hall in order not to soil and desecrate the floor, which was covered with mats on which the worshippers stood, sat, and prostrated themselves in the performance of their religious devotions. Unlike a church, in which everything is directed like a pathway toward the sanctuary of the altar, a mosque is not built on any such plan. For although the prayer niche, the mihrab, is related in form to the choir in a Christian church, its sole purpose is to indicate the direction of Mecca and to echo the words of the imam. The imam conducts the communal prayers at the prescribed hours of the day, but in addition to these set times, any believer can say his prayers in any part of the mosque whenever he wishes. The unusual construction of the arches, which fan out from the columns in two tiers, one above the other, like the branches of a date palm, was obviously adopted because the first architect of the mosque had many columns from Roman ruins at his disposal, which could bear great weight, but were not tall enough to provide a hall of such a great area with a ceiling of proportional height, even when vaulted with arches. The architect overcame this difficulty by capping the columns with heavy abaci and placing square pillars on them, from which spring the arches that support the roof. This feature too is reminiscent of palm branches. The most magnificent part of the mosque, consisting of the surviving prayer niche and the domed cluster of pillars, was built by Al-Hakam II. This was no coincidence, for Al-Hakam II had inherited a flourishing, secure empire from his father and had the time and the inclination to foster the arts and the sciences. It is characteristic of Islamic art that the most sumptuous decoration is used to frame and venerate something which itself is not visible, namely the spoken word. The word takes the place occupied by sacred images in Christian art. Islam rejects devotional images because they tend to commit divine reality over much to a limited form. That is not to say that the holy writings are not symbols too. Their way of using metaphorical forms to clothe divine reality makes them symbols too, yet ones which are not solidified, so to speak. Written over the vertex of the arch is a verse from the Quran. In the name of God, the compassionate, the all-merciful. He is God, the one beside whom there is no other divinity, the King, the Holy One, the peaceful, the faithful, the protector, the glorious, the victorious, the exalted. Praised be God beyond all that they, the heathens, attribute to him. In the 10th century, at the height of Cordoba's flowering, The mosque pulsated with activity, for at that time the city had more than 1 million inhabitants and was surrounded by a cluster of small townships and villages that spread over the fertile plain of the Guadalquivir. To the west, about 2 hours traveling distance from the city, lay Medinat Azara, the royal residence built by Abd al-Rahman III. To the north lay the summer palace, Ar-Rusafa, and shortly before the caliphate came to an end, the administrative city of Medinat az-Zahira was built east of Cordoba. For the Islamic city, the Great Friday Mosque represented what the cathedral is to a Christian city. Religious instruction was also given here and tribunals held. The teachers always included famous men, many of whom had visited the holy places of Islam and had completed their education in Arabia, Syria, and Egypt. They would sit in one of the lighter parts of the great pillared hall at the foot of a particular column and dispense their knowledge freely, not only to the students who crouched on the mats in a semicircle before them, but also to passers-by and to learned visitors. All branches of learning that had some bearing on religion were taught, including not only knowledge of Arabic, in which the Quran was revealed, but also the law in all its aspects, for in Islam there is no civil law. The arrangement of human society is covered in every detail by religion. In another part of the Great Hall, the Supreme Judge of Cordoba would conduct court sessions at certain times. Although he was second in importance only to the Chancellor or Prime Minister, he would receive the disputing parties in as homely a fashion as if he were sitting in a Bedouin tent. Where the case was a straightforward one, he would announce judgment on the spot, and this would be irreversible. In cases where the circumstances were uncertain, he would often prefer to leave the matter to God, unless this meant prolonging an existing injustice. Many of the foremost judges of Cordoba were famous for the independence and justice of their rulings. The teaching and the court sessions would break off when, from the far side of the courtyard, the call to prayer would sound from the minaret of the mosque. God is greater. God is greater. Arise to prayer. Arise to salvation. I testify that there is no God but God, and I testify that Muhammad is God's messenger. God is greater. God is greater. There is no God but God. The communal prayers were recited 5 times a day, as they are to this day in Islamic countries, before sunrise, at midday, halfway through the afternoon, after sunset, and at the beginning of the night. This rhythmic repetition of the same ritual with its eternal, unchanging meaning implanted an indelible seal on the entire way of life, and despite the disputes and troubles that divided Islamic Spain, the unity of the seal was never broken.